Welcome. My name is Sabrina Shankman. I report on climate change at the Boston Globe, and I'll be moderating today's discussion of air pollution and the brain. I am delighted to be joined by today's panelists. Pleased to introduce Maite Arce, President and CEO of Hispanic Access Foundation, Joe Allen, an Associate Professor of Exposure Assessment Science and Environmental Health, and the Director of the Healthy Buildings Program here at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Francesca Dominici, the Clarence James Gamble Professor of Biostatistics, Population and Data Science at the Harvard Chan School, and Mark Weisskopf, the Cecil K. and Philip Drinker Professor of Environmental Epidemiology and Physiology, also at Harvard Chan School. Thank you all for being here. A reminder that today all of the speakers here are going to be sharing their own views. They do not speak for the school. And thank you all for being here today in the audience. So let's jump in. An increasing amount of evidence has linked air pollution exposure to poor brain health, including cognitive decline and mood disorders. Mark and Francesca, maybe you could start us off. What do we know about the connection between the air we breathe and our brains?
Start? Okay, I'll start.
Go ahead.
Well, there is more and more emerging evidence that especially long-term exposure to air pollution increase incidence and progression of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson and other neurocognitive disease. The work I've been conducting together with many colleagues here at the School of Public Health are been basically analyzing the entire national healthcare system, the Medicare and Medicaid claims. We've been following several individuals over time, actually not several, million of individuals over time, assessing their long-term exposure to fine particulate matter. And so very briefly, and then I can say more about it, but what we are finding from this study with enormous statistical power is that long-term exposure to fine particulate matter increases the incidence and hospitalization of Alzheimer's disease. It also increases the progression in terms of rehospitalization of Alzheimer's disease. And also we are seeing that among people that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, exposure to fine particulate matter tends to increase the rate of hospitalization for all causes and also increase risk of mortality.
Okay. Mark,
yeah, and I guess if I can add from a sort of biological perspective, I mean, I think sort of the exploration of air pollution in the brain is relatively new. It's newer than many other outcomes. And I think one of the early things that got people interested in thinking this might be going on was the wealth of data that exists already on things like cardiovascular effects of air pollution, which there's a lot of data behind on many levels. And the brain is frankly hugely dependent on the cardiovascular system. So if the cardiovascular system's affected, we think there could be impacts on the brain. And I think that started, that sort of was at the origins of the interest that maybe something's going on there. And we do know that that can absolutely happen. And that is one of the things that, one of the ways the brain can be impacted through air pollution. There's a lot of interest now, and it's an active area of exactly what biology is happening with these particles. But there's, particles can generate sort of inflammatory immune effects in the systemic circulation that can get to the brain. There's some ideas that the particles can get to the brain directly, actually, not just through these secondary effects. And more recently, there's been a lot of interest on the idea that actually, so when you breathe in through your nose, you're smelling things because you've got neurons that are kind of sticking out in the world, exploring it that way. And we now understand that some particles or aspects of particles can actually get transported directly back into the brain, so skipping the lungs and the cardiovascular system. So that's an almost more immediate route. And people have seen, in like dogs from Mexico City versus a cleaner part of Mexico, you can sort of see effects that we believe to be the particle type effects going on in the brain, and sort of evidence there that something is happening. But it's a very active area of research as to this very specific biology of what may be going on. But there are many things that could be happening.
That's fascinating. We're going to ask a little bit more about that in a little bit, because that is a really interesting area. But it's not just these kinds of effects that we've seen. I understand there's also a link to anxiety and depression from poor air quality, and that's shown up in school performance too. Joe, could you talk a little bit about the acute effects on cognitive tests that you've seen?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually had a program right here at the School of Public Health on the surprising link between air pollution and mental health. And our team summarized the findings that you see largely kids, and we see air pollution linked with things like anxiety, suicide ideation, big studies and we see increases in pediatric hospitalizations related to psychiatric disorders linked to air pollution. My own work has been around indoor air quality, so another type of air pollution and cognitive function impacts. So we've done studies of, say, office workers where we've changed the air they were breathing. We introduced air pollution into their space. In this case, it was air pollution like off-gassing from dry cleaning and dry erase markers without them knowing in a double-blind study, and then we test their cognitive function performance. And we see they perform worse on these tests. And these tests are things like, how do I seek out and utilize information in the world? How do I make strategic decisions? How to respond during a crisis? And that was in a double-blind controlled study. But then we did that same kind of study globally, and we had about 450 office workers, and the same thing. And we looked at indoor air quality and these cognitive outcomes, and this will tie into the work here. We actually saw a link between PM2.5, so a main component of outdoor air pollution, and acute performance on these cognitive function tests. So air pollution measured at your desk, most of which is coming from outside, and these acute tests. So across all these dimensions, it was office workers, university workers, kids in elementary school, high school students, we see over and over the impacts of air pollution on the whole range, mental health, anxiety, all the way through higher order cognitive function.
Wow. And Mayta, you've seen something related to schools, right?
Yes, we have talked to parents in high Latino populated communities, and high exposure to particle matter 2.5 increases, it may increase the respiratory infections of children, which can lead to symptoms like asthma, and that can lead to school absences, and it can lead to less participation in school activity, and so it's definitely a concern that parents have.
What about when it comes to mental health, Mark? You've looked at that a bit.
Yeah, so we did one of the first studies in the Nurses' Health Study looking at PM and its relation to anxiety symptoms there. So absolutely, I mean, there's more of the focus is on kind of cognitive processing and for the knowledge, economy, et cetera. But all the kind of processing in the brain that is underlying how you learn and remember and how you function on a cognitive level is basically the same for mental health scenarios, and possibly there it's even can be considered more sensitive in a sense. So, if you sort of disrupt the what's going on in the brain, you can put yourself into bad brain states, and that can either exacerbate underlying problems. And this is a big issue of what is actually occurring. Is it an exacerbation of something that's underlying in there, or is it actually, or both, is it actually contributing to a new development of something like that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Mark is saying, from analyzing massive amount of data, what we are also saying that exposure to greenness, and so being able to spend more time in green parks actually has a protective effect on hospitalization and progression of Alzheimer's disease. We haven't looked specifically to mental health. These are mostly studied in the elderly, but it complements and it's consistent with what Mark is saying. Now, we need to understand even better whether the access to the green space also means that there is less particulate matter because you are in the park, but we're actually seeing an evidence that even with the same exposure to particulate matter, if you are close to a park or you're spending more time in a park, the adverse effect of particulate matter on Alzheimer's is lower than if you don't have access to green space.
Do you know what it is about that access to the park that is causing that?
Well, we are not studying the mechanism, and we can't, so not really. But I think that could provide some hypothesis of what additional, biological mechanism we want to study that will inform that protective effect. But we do have tremendous amount of evidence of a positive effect of spending time in nature has a protective effect on mental health. So I think, I will guess it will be a similar mechanism.
Interesting. Communities of color are often disproportionately exposed to pollution. Here's an example. More than 56 million Latinos live in the 15 worst urban areas with the most ground-level ozone pollution. So there's a clip from a video that we're going to watch from the Hispanic Access Foundation. It's an interview with a woman who's been impacted by air pollution in Phoenix, Arizona.
Hi, my name is Yara Marin, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. So I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, specifically South Central Phoenix, which is the epicenter of pollution and factories. And as a result, I actually grew up having asthma, and a lot of my cousins and my friends growing up did too. And so it was very frustrating as I got older to learn that that was a direct result of the environment that I grew up in, the parks that I went to, and because I was exposed to a lot of those dirty fossil fuels and that pollution from living under highways. And so as I've gotten older, it has really become important for me to do Latino advocacy, especially around public parks and outdoors, and ensuring that our Latino children and our community members have access to clean parks where they can step outside, enjoy our beautiful Madre Tierra, and not have to worry about having respiratory issues or being exposed to dirty fossil fuels and harmful fumes that can cause asthma.
Maite, can you talk a little bit about how the Hispanic Access Foundation has been working with Latino communities on air pollution?
Yes, we have just started a long-range program called El Aire que Respiramos, the air that we breathe. And we've recruited citizen scientists from 12 communities who are members of our faith-based networks who have the trust of their communities. And they are, they formed a cohort, a learning cohort, where they're connecting with their peers to talk about air pollution, and also learning from experts in air quality. These leaders, these citizen scientists, are using air quality sensors in their churches to monitor and report air quality in their communities, and then they're entering the data into an online mapping, an online map. They're also helping to work with us to develop materials that are tailored to the needs of their communities, who are primarily Spanish-speaking or immigrant communities, and they're disseminating that information in a variety of ways, from sermons at church services to film screenings and roundtables to community workshops, radio and social media. And then they're also supporting community in making practical changes to help improve their preparation when there's bad air quality days, like masking or staying indoors. And then very importantly, which is something Yara mentioned in the film, is they are advocates. And so they're inviting elected officials, decision makers into their churches to hear their concerns. And then they're also organizing in the community to really urge for policy change.
So across the sites where you're monitoring, what have you learned so far?
The biggest learning is how little to no knowledge there is about particulate matter 2.5. Just we're starting at zero in terms of the knowledge. People understand and are concerned and have been for a long time about the health and effects that they're seeing and what they're seeing in their community, but the understanding is just really eye-opening for them and makes them feel that urgency to take action.
Yeah. I mean, is there a lot known about those kind of racial and economic disparities when it comes to this? Like, where's the research on that? I don't know if I'm just kind of, if anyone.
Well, I mean, we published a study in Nature 3 years ago where we looked at exposure to fine particulate matter in the last 20 years by census tract in the United States, and look at chronic exposure by the percentage of underrepresented and minority in that census tract. And not surprising, what we saw is that although exposure to fine particulate matter, thanks to the Clean Air Act, has been decreasing over time, quite a lot actually, and that is definitely an excellent news. But we did see that the disparities, and so underrepresented minority, Hispanic, Latino, Black American, consistently breathe higher level of air pollution than white American. The other interesting thing is that happened especially for Black American, even when you stratified by socioeconomic status. So in the context of Black American, we didn't look at that specific question for Hispanic population, and we should and we will. But for Black American, what we found, which was very surprising to me, that high socioeconomic status Black American breed higher pollution level than low socioeconomic status white American. So that tells you a lot about the systemic bias and racism. Why? Well, what happened is in this marginalized community, there is less pressure and less attention to be in compliance with the different EPA rules. And we see that systematically. By the way, there is a, I don't want to speak too much about it, but there is a different study that we're conducting right now on exposure to air pollution from cryptocurrency data mining, which are not regulated in the United States. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, where this data mining and cryptocurrency are building, where are located, they tend always to be located in the lower socioeconomic status or in represented minority because there is not the local government and the pressure of the citizen and the knowledge to fight back.
Does like historic redlining factor into this?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And if I could add related to that, because all of this is absolutely true, but one of the reasons why understanding the mechanisms of this stuff is important is that my suspicion is that at least one part of this is going to be a slightly more generic effect on the brain. So it will produce inflammation, immune response, things like that are generally perturb the brain and have all sorts of effects. But so do many other things, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that air pollution is specifically the thing that causes Alzheimer's disease, right? But I think it's giving us a picture into potential mechanisms that get targeted by lots of other stuff. So on top of minoritized populations often having higher exposures to, say, air pollution, they also, as illustrated by that little clip you
Yes.
showed, have exposures to lots of other things. And so that can do all sorts of things. I mean, we just did a talk about the idea that maybe, and this is one of the things we think, there's something called the blood-brain barrier that is supposed to keep stuff out of the brain, but you can inflame that and you can make that leaky. And the more you're exposed to all these things, the worse that gets. So it's a double whammy of largely being exposed more to the very things, but also to many things, because these are the areas that aren't as regulated or people sort of let industry go, and then you have all sorts of exposures like that person
Yeah.
on the clip.
I think one other thing, just to add to this and bring it back to Maitais, the work you're all doing, is that there's really been a fundamental shift in the technology, and it has led to empowerment and citizen science. So it used to be you'd have an EPA air quality monitor, a handful of them really around the country. We have some sophisticated models, but we've now put the power in the hands of the community to monitor for themselves and see what's happening. And that's because relatively new advent of relatively low cost air quality sensors. They're not scientific instruments, but you can see pretty quickly and put it in the hands for what used to be tens of thousands of dollars, now $100 or $200. And people can measure the air pollution in their home, in their yard, in their community at the micro level. Like what's happening outside of my home, not relying on some report or other data. So it's a real big shift because it's put the power back in the hands of people to say, I can actually see, make the invisible visible. This is what's happening in my area. I don't need to see the study. I can see the monitor. And I feel it, and I can see it. So it's a real shift in terms of the power dynamics of who has the power to monitor.
And also to Maite's point about making that connect, that you were saying that it was surprising how people weren't connecting, they didn't know about PM 2.5. Part of it is you don't see it, right? It is tiny. I mean, this is like many times smaller than a human hair. And so to have a device like this that actually makes it a little bit more visually apparent to you in some way is one of the ways to sort of get a better understanding for it.
And to your point, Joe, putting the power into the hands of community, the community that lives this and breathes this, is really important because they are the answer. They're able to really speak about their experiences to elected officials, decision makers. They can really be a powerful support in helping to change what happens in their communities.
To what extent is there a relationship between citizen science and the work that you all are doing in the more kind of traditional sense of science? Is there a lot of conversation happening and collaboration?
I'll jump in first. I think
Yeah.
absolutely. We had a really nice
Yeah.
conversation over lunch about the overlapping work. So my team right now, we're doing a project out in Lahaina related to the wildfires, and the wildfires long extinguished, but the exposure to particles as things get resuspended during the reconstruction is causing continued exposure. But we're doing it with community partners from there who know the landscape, been absolutely devastated in terms of loss of life, loss of property, loss of community, but they're able to, they have the monitors, they have the network, they're trusted partners. So there's no way we could ever pull off this kind of work without partners like Maite. And we're not working with her on that project, but it's very similar.
Yeah.
We'll probably work on other ones after the lunch conversation, I'm sure.
Great.
But yeah, it has to work like that. Yeah.
And that collaboration is now easier to do because of the tools that are available that are less expensive and more accessible, and these partnerships as well.
Some of my work has a different flavor. I will not consider myself in any way someone expert in citizen science as well, although I completely recognize the value and the importance. I think the way that we are trying to try to inform the local community is to provide interpretable, transparent, and localized information. So because we analyze entire national care system and air pollution data and claims data for all the continental United States for the last 20 years, instead of just publishing once again a research article, is to provide actually easy to access and localized data, so then the local community can actually go on the computer and see what's happening in their own census tract. Not only what's happening in terms of level of pollution, but also to understand whether or not their community is more at risk for certain diseases than others. And then it's really providing an empowering tool, as well as monitoring and reporting and we'll talk about that later, where there are the most dangerous, for example, coal-fired power plants, and whether or not they are near their community, whether there are other industrial facilities they could have a adverse health effect. And so it's trying to provide the rigorous data, so then we empower the community to speak.
Sure. So it's like a two-way street. Basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You were talking before about how the Clean Air Act has helped kind of eliminate some of the major sources of pollution, or at least mitigate them to some extent. And the EPA recently approved stronger standards for soot pollution, strengthening the annual health-based national ambient air quality standard for fine particulate matter. How do you expect that this will impact air quality in the U.S. going forward?
Well, it will have a huge impact and a positive impact because that's the law. And so, I think that the revision of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, for context, the current safety standard for long-term exposure to fine particulate matter is an annual average of 12 microgram per cubic meter, and the Biden administration has recently announced that it will be lowered to 9, a national average of 9, so three units, which is a substantial act in terms of making it more stringent. I'm really proud to say that the school, and starting with the Harvard 6 City studies and many of the studies that myself and my colleague have conducted, have been instrumental in forming that. The rule is one of I would say, the biggest public health victory in a very long time. So it's going to have a huge effect, for the simple fact that by law, the counties, all the different states, will have to submit to the Environmental Protection Agency a state implementation plan, and they will have to tell the Environmental Protection Agency if they're not in compliance with the rule, so if their annual average or some approximation is higher than 9, how they're going to get there, how they're going to be in compliance. And so what it means also, it means that they will have to look very closely to their inventory, what are all the sources of fine particulate matter, whether it's traffic, where is industry, whether it's natural gas, coal-fired power plants, and then they will have to say how they're going to cut that sources to be in compliance. And so lower fine particulate matter, less adverse health effect, and longer life for everybody. So it's a really good, fantastic victory.
But why 9? Why is 9 the number?
Oh, that's a very good question. So we did a study in the New England Journal of Medicine that was accelerated to inform the the rule, and we look at the health benefit when you go from 12 to 10, 12 to 9, 12 to 8. And so, one might ask, well, why not 0, right? So I think that 0 is nearly impossible because there is always going to be some background level of fine particulate matter. The evidence that there are thousands of studies all around the world, none of the studies have provided evidence that there is a threshold, or what that means is a lower level of fine particulate matter below which there is no adverse health effect. So bottom line is, ideally, you want it to get as low as possible, as low as feasible. In the study that we published, we showed, of course, going from 12 to 8 will be the best, especially for underrepresented minority, because in that study, we really want to look at the benefit, not only on average for the population, but also look at the benefit for the different underrepresented minority. They went to 9, which to me, it sounds like they try to be as aggressive as they can, still being feasible, right? But there is not data to point out that 9 is the magic number, and below 9 there are no adverse health effects.
Yeah,
so it's a compromise between the science and I would say the political landscape.
We love a number that we can hang our hats on.
And to that very point, it's slightly problematic. I mean, so I was on the panel that came up with this, and this is really, it's all about how the sausage gets made, right? So it's a bunch of people around a table, and there are those arguing for it to be higher, and there are those like me who are arguing for it to be lower, and we battle over it, and they settle on something. But one of the issues is, that panel is not supposed to take economic considerations into account, right? Okay. So now somebody else does that at some point, so that's another thing that plays in. But to Francesca's point, it is true. The data, you can go down lower, and the data sort of, I personally think actually would suggest lower is also very protective, but weird things happen, like they want a number, right? And so when they look at studies, they say, well, what was the mean of the exposure in that study? And so that study must be speaking to the mean. And so I spent a lot of time in this panel arguing that there's a lot of great data that's not at the mean, and it's below the mean. And in fact, if you only had the mean, you don't have any kind of distribution, so you can't show anything. And it's things like that we're making arguments. They actually tended to downgrade Canadian studies because they're not in the US, but Canada happens to be cleaner, so they have studies at lower levels. But some people downgraded them because they're not American. So, it's that kind of process.
I am grateful for the work that you contributed. The new pollution standards will improve air quality and begin to address the injustices and inequities that have existed historically.
I will say that the WHO's limit is 5. They suggest 5. Now, surprisingly to me, and I only learned this relatively recently, that Europe is actually worse than us. Their levels are higher than we have. But the WHO, which is really supposedly just focused on health, has come down to 5.
While we're talking about numbers,
yeah.
So our colleagues here have done amazing work and saved many hundreds of thousands of lives because of this effort to get the national ambient air quality standards from 12 now down to 9. WHO says 5. And Francesca pointed out these are legally enforceable. That's why they'll work. Do you know what the legally enforceable particle limit is for indoor air and workers? Not 12, not 9, not 5. 5,000. 5,000 is the current legally enforceable limit for indoor particles. There's a major disconnect because outdoor air pollution penetrates inside. We have indoor sources of particles, and yet for our workers, the only standard is OSHA's standard. It's grossly out of date. So we're down at 9, 5, 12. This is going to have we know it's going to have a massive impact on 12 to 9. What would it do if we lowered our worker limit from 5,000 to something reasonable, like orders of magnitude lower? And we have national ambient air quality standards because of the work of my colleagues over decades. We don't have a national indoor air quality standard. So today we're talking about how does air pollution impact the brain. I think all of us, first thought is outdoor air pollution. There's a whole other world of air pollution. It's indoor air pollution. And our standards are nothing like what we've done for outdoor air pollution or the successes we've had. It's a major problem in public health. And quite honestly, in our regulatory structure, how we think about air pollution as just outdoor air pollution.
Why is that?
OSHA on its website says our standards are out of date. They acknowledge this, and that's for chemicals and everything else. We don't spend as much time thinking about the indoor environment, not nearly the amount of resources. We don't have a study like Francesca said, millions of people. A big study in my field, I mentioned 450 people. It's very different. We don't have these huge cohort studies. We haven't done this Harvard 6 City study, followed tens of thousands of people for 10 years. We haven't done it to the indoor environment. It's a loose collection of researchers scraping for money, really trying to uplift this research. But that's, it's just we don't think about it. There's a regulatory issue. Who has regulatory authority over this? EPA is outdoor. They have guidance on indoor, but no real regulatory authority. So it's really OSHA is the legally enforceable limits for worker protection indoors. Doesn't count for your home either. This is a real problem.
So yeah, I mean, thank you, Joe. I think that's a huge issue. I think that what's the most important thing to do in that context is to identify what are the indoor sources that get to these extremely high elevated PM2.5. I mean, I would say in the great majority, if it's low PM2.5 outside, it's going to be low PM2.5 inside, unless workers are working in a setting where this level of fine particulate matter are really high. So I think that there is definitely a need. You don't need to conduct a study like million people. I think what you need to do is to identify sources of indoor pollution that lead to this high level of PM2.5 indoor and then regulate.
One of the issues is, yes, in the work setting, you can potentially think of regulations through OSHA, but in your home, you turn on your gas stove, and Joe will tell you, you're gonna get a massive spike of particulate matter. So, what do we do with that?
Yeah, if you're cooking, you're stir frying something, you'll get particle levels at 100, 200, and depending on your ventilation or filtration, it'll linger for hours indoors. And so you have indoor sources. You also have outdoor pollution sources, and even think about what happens with outdoor. Let's say it's 12 microgram cubic meter outside, and your building takes out half of that, so it's 6 inside. All right, your building did a good job, but you spend 90% of your time indoors. Most of the outdoor air pollution you breathe happens inside. Most of the outdoor air pollution you breathe happens inside, even with that reduction happening, just because it's the amount of time. So, but we know we can design, to get to solutions, we can design places that actually reduce that 12 to virtually nothing if you have good levels of filtration, good building design. So we can lower that burden even further. So you have the indoor space. All right, I'm biased. This is my topic, but we're talking about air pollution. I think it's really important. You have outdoor air pollution that penetrates inside. Right. We're breathing it, outdoor air pollution inside. Plus, you're inundated with all these indoor sources, and then workers can have totally disproportionate impacts depending on whatever they're doing, where the particle levels can be in the thousands of microgram per cubic meter.
Well, you raise such an interesting point, because you can think about things that you can't really regulate out of existence, like wildfires.
Yes.
Right? But you could potentially regulate, say, a building code to be more protective of people on the inside. So, and wildfires is something that I want to talk about, because increasingly that's becoming a big story for us globally, across the US, and even here in the Boston area, where we're starting to feel the effects of wildfire smoke in a more regular way, including last summer. So, let's talk more about what people can do to protect themselves in situations when the air quality is bad. And Mai-Tai, why don't you talk about that? Why don't you start out?
I think for communities, the more we can equip them and with opportunities to learn about PM 2.5 and how to, and then help them to also create their own plans for their families and households about what is around them and what are the practical things they can do in indoors as well as outdoors, like wearing a mask and staying indoors if there's a wildfire or there's smoke in the air. I think also communities want to be part of the solution. So when Francesca mentioned green space and parks, communities are planting trees and native plants. They want that oxygen. And so I think equipping communities with more information will help them be part of designing what those practical methods to protect themselves are.
Joe, do you want to talk some more?
Sure. I think it'll combine some threads about these low-cost sensors and what to do with building and outdoor air pollution. So when the wildfire blanketed the East Coast, the Canadian wildfires, the skies in New York turned orange. And so the levels hit, 300, 400, right? So maybe even higher. In buildings that weren't designed well, have low levels of filtration, we'd see 200 or 100 inside. That's extremely dangerous. But in buildings that put in enhanced filtration, the exact kind of filters we were talking about all through COVID, maybe people are familiar with the MERV 13 filter or higher, we saw much lower levels. So I'll give this building as an example, because the wildfire smoke hit Boston first. Outdoor levels were extremely high in Boston. Indoor, we kept it below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard because we have upgraded our filters to MERV 13 or 15. Those capture about 80 or 90% of the particles. We have the portable air cleaners running here, and we knew it was successful in real time because we deployed a real-time air quality sensing network in our classrooms. So not only we say, hey, we think the building's operating correctly, we can rely on the outdoor air monitors. We had indoor air quality monitors that said, yeah, our building's performing, and actually we could rightly reassure people that, well, the outdoor pollution's bad, inside our buildings we're safe. Harvard School of Public Health is doing this, Harvard Business School. We just got the Harvard Health Clinics to put in air quality monitors. I work with a lot of companies that do this up and down and across the world at this point, actually, to measure indoor air quality and then improve things like filtration as a protection against wildfire, but also just everyday outdoor air pollution.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, it's fantastic, and I think although it reminds us once again of the potential inequity that we see with the consequences of climate change related exposure, right? Mm-hmm. So Harvard, we're now breathing clean air, right? And we have the ability to put expensive filter, and we know because we are the expert, as well as, you know, potentially very well-off companies, but what's happening in the communities. And so we do know that as a result of greenhouse gases and climate change, we're going to have this wildfire becoming more common and more extreme. And they are highly educated, and people that are well off will be able to have access and purchase expensive filters. What are we doing as a science community to disseminate the information and provide the resources of the low-income community that we know already right now they're going to be affected? Are they going to have access to that filters? And so I think also I have to say that I've been seeing the major tech company, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they actually are stepping in to provide. I mean, you know, a classical partnership. Why Amazon? I mean, and you know, I'm saying that live, that has all the resources, will not cost them too much to deliver and send free air filter to the low-income community, where we know and we can tell them right now which will be the community that will be affected by the wildfire. So I think indoor air is important, and it's critical important, and we can now have the tools to clean the air indoor, but we need to make it accessible to everybody and not only to the, you know, the people there that can.
All right, Amazon, if you're watching,
Yes.
you have a spot.
Jumping.
Yes.
Just as a warning, we've only got about 3 minutes left. But Mark, did you have anything you wanted to weigh in about this?
Yeah, well, I wanted to, this is sort of touching on another point that I would
Yeah.
like to talk about, the business of we talk about sources indoors and whatnot, but this is also true outside. And so wildfires is an example of one source of PM, but I think it's important for people to understand that, I mean, PM, particulate matter 2.5, is simply stuff in the air. It's whatever of that size. And depending on whether you're in Boston or LA or Phoenix, that's going to be different, right? I mean, on the coast, it might have a lot of sea salt in it, for example. Wildfire is a very specific one. This is an area that we're not as advanced in, and partly because the models are not so that as extensive to be able to say what is actually in that particulate matter. Because for the brain, it's very important. I mean, you can have a lead element, you know, atom stuck to a particle that gets into your brain, and that lead will do something very specific. Something else might do something specific. So knowing where they come from not only helps us understand a little bit potentially about what is really the most toxic factor, but also how to intervene on a public health perspective, because it's possible. And a recent paper came out on dementia trying to do this, looking at sources, and they kind of said, at least in this paper, I think it's the first, I'm not going to say this is the final answer and more needs to be done, but they sort of targeted, they said that the wildfire signal and agricultural PM was particularly related to the dementia, the subsequent dementia, right? So trying to figure out what piece of this, is it traffic, is it coal power plants, is it wildfires? Now wildfires we can't do much about, but they're particularly interesting because, I mean, there's massive heat generated there, all sorts of, even if it's in the forest, strange things come up, dioxins get produced, things of that sort. But more and more, these wildfires are actually at the interface between forests and urban areas. And now you're starting to burn homes and buildings, and that's producing all sorts of different stuff. So it's a very different gamish, depending on where you are. And part of, I think, where we need to go in the future is to try and pinpoint, does it matter? Is it any of this stuff, or are there particular ones that are particularly relevant? Because that may tell us where to focus our efforts on interventions.
I'm gonna just queue up our last question rapid fire style because we have like 1 minute left. If you could change one thing today to improve air quality, what would it be? Let's go right down the line.
Expand the number of citizen scientists in the most affected communities.
Nice.
right.
Related to what Francesca was saying, we were trying to change the standards. The only way it benefits everyone everywhere is if the standards change. We're changing standards for outdoor air pollution. We're trying to get the standards to be changed for how we design and operate buildings such that it's not who can afford a filter and they're relatively cheap, but it's just that's the norm. We shouldn't have unhealthy buildings. It should be the standards should be healthy buildings. That's how they're designed and made and operated.
Shut down all the coal-fired power plants.
All right.
Lower the standard further.
We
All right. There we go. Well, thank you all so much for this insightful conversation. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately that's it for today. If you missed any part of the program, you can rewatch it on the YouTube page. Have a great afternoon.
Okay, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. My name is Larry Cretion, and I'm the director here at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I am joined by Anna Vandersbeck and Loie Hayes for presentations tonight. The topic is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a federal law, and how it affects energy and climate. Next slide, please. So Green Energy Consumers Alliance is a nonprofit organization. I hope you're familiar with us. If not, we're a nonprofit organization that empowers consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. Our viewpoint is that we are making a shift from fossil fuels to clean energy, but not fast enough. So we emphasize the word speed. We also emphasize the word just. We want a just transition that means that as we make the transition to clean energy, we make sure no one's left behind, that everyone benefits. We were founded in 1982, 41 years ago. We serve Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We have offices in Boston and Providence, and we have a robust mix of programs that consumers can tap into. You can look at them at our website, greenenergyconsumers.org. And we advocate for better public policy at the state level, at the state houses in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Next slide. So here are the takeaways I'd like you to think about. The first is what we're going to talk about. The Federal Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer. It sounds like a cliche. It might be an overused term, but it applies in this case. It's the largest investment in the clean energy transition that the world has ever seen. It's not enough, but it's going to help move us much faster towards decarbonization. We'll explain how you can combine the incentives that are in the Inflation Reduction Act with state incentives to bring down the cost of clean energy. The incentives, what's really great about them is they're available for at least 10 years, which means you can plan out how to get to zero carbon for your home. It's not something you have to do overnight. And so you can phase in some of the projects you might want to do. And there are great opportunities in your community where you live, the cities and towns. And so we recommend that if you have any influence on city and town hall, try to get them to do some planning, identify sites where they can put clean energy projects into place, find partners, find contractors. Then what's really exciting for us is that there are tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, and then there's a provision that says that tax exempt organizations, nonprofits like ours, or a community, or religious affiliations can receive direct payment equivalent to the tax credit. So it opens up new opportunities for us. Next slide. When the bill was passed over a year ago, this is an estimate by the Congressional Budget Office about what kind of investment it was going to incentivize. And they thought that it would be about $369 billion, of which much more than half was going to be affecting the electricity sector. But as it turns out, that's just an estimate because a lot of it's about tax credits, and they were sort of guessing how much corporations and residents were going to take advantage of the tax credits. Now, a lot of experts are saying that the investment could be double or triple that number, and that's why we're here tonight. We want to encourage people to take advantage of what's ahead. Next slide. Go forward a couple. There you go. Here's a site. We're going to email you out all these slides, and you can find this on your own. But there's an organization that's been calculating, mapping all the great investments that are happening in the country in the areas of battery storage, clean electricity, clean vehicles, solar, wind, whether it's for manufacturing or whatever, even recycling of materials. A lot of the benefits are going to go to people at home, to businesses that use energy, but also what's very impressive is there'll be a lot of money to encourage the domestic manufacture of clean energy, whether it's batteries, cars, solar panels, wind turbines, and all that. So, and that's going to help drive down the cost of clean energy as we get improves the supply chain. Next slide. One thing we're very excited about, we'll be talking at length here about tax credits and whatnot, but there's also a greenhouse gas reduction fund that's going to be funded to $27 billion, which is obviously an incredible amount of money. It's going to establish really what's called a green bank to provide low-cost financing for clean energy. Governor Healy did a good thing. She established a Massachusetts Community Climate Bank for affordable housing that will be a repository of funds. The state put in $50 million, but that's going to help create a place where the federal government can pour some money in. Within the $27 billion, there's $7 billion for a Solar for All program that's targeted towards making sure that solar benefits low and moderate income people. And we're very pleased. We had a little bit of input into the proposal that the state of Massachusetts put in for the maximum award of $250 million. The state has written its proposal, probably should hear about it within, say, 3 months. And hopefully the money will start flowing to Massachusetts if we win. But that will be a game changer. The state of Rhode Island has also applied for a lot of money. And we're hopeful that both states will receive funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund on that. But then there'll also be another $20 billion coming out for other programs to be determined. So equity is a big part of the Inflation Reduction Act throughout. Next slide. So I'm going to give you some rundown of the federal residential clean energy credits. Again, they will be going for 10 years, which is a lot better. The solar tax credit, for example, was set to expire, but now it's going on for 10 or more years. It applies to several technologies: solar PV, water heating, home battery storage with or without solar. For the first time, you can now get a 30% tax credit with home battery storage. And geothermal ground source heat pumps are eligible. The amount will start at 30%. Actually, in 2022, will run up to 30% through 2032. Then it drops off over the next couple of years after that to 26 and 24%, which is still pretty good. But what's also exciting is that you can get an extra 10% if the project is in a certified low-income community. That's a census tract where it's 80% of the area median income. And you can get a tax credit of 20% more for a total of 50% if the economic benefits from the project flow to low-income households. So we're actually, we'll talk more, but we think that this will mean a lot of solar for benefiting low-income communities and low-income households. And that's in addition to that Solar for All program I mentioned. For more information, you can go to the IRS website for that. We strongly recommend, if you're interested in the clean energy incentives, go to rewiringamerica.org and look for their IRA calculator. You type in your zip code, your home, whether you own or rent, what your household income is, whether you're filing single or jointly, and how many people are in your house. It's a great source of information. It's they won't have your name. It's anonymous, but that'll help. They will use that to determine whether or not you're in a house, an area that is eligible for some of the enhanced rebates and tax credits. Next slide. And so, what I'm excited to report is that a lot of nonprofit organizations that have tried to install solar, they've had to sometimes partner with a for-profit company, because previously the tax credits were only available to companies that had a tax liability. And so what that usually meant was, if a nonprofit or a city hall wanted to put solar panels on top, they'd have to lease the roof to a for-profit corporation and hopefully get paid in some way by that corporation. But the corporation would be taking the tax credit. Now, if it's an option that's available to us as nonprofit organizations and communities, is to do a project, can still go with a for-profit corporation if you wanted, but now we can get the equivalent of the direct pay. Essentially, what that means is the U.S. Treasury Department would send a check to the tax exempt organization. So we're excited about that. We're actually planning on doing some projects that way at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Now, the states also have great solar incentives, both of them, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They both have a policy called net metering, which when the solar is running, essentially makes your meter go backwards to offset your own energy use. That's called behind the meter. Massachusetts additionally has a different program. Instead of net metering, they have a program called SMART, and that's where you sign up, and for a period of years you'll get a guaranteed amount per kilowatt hour paid to you by the utility. The net metering benefit can fluctuate as your electricity rate will fluctuate, and the SMART incentive does not fluctuate. In Massachusetts, you can also get a tax credit of up to $1,000 for installing solar, 15% of the cost of the system. In Rhode Island, similar, instead of the SMART program, they call it Renewable Energy Growth. And they also have a fund called the Renewable Energy Fund that will help with small scale solar. But then in addition, go to the next bullet, in Rhode Island, they have a renewable energy growth program that cannot be combined with net metering. That's similar to the SMART program mentioned above. If you are interested in solar, we've had great success. We have a partner called Energy Sage. You can access Energy Sage through our website at greenenergyconsumers.org/solar. It's easy. You can register for free. What you do is you go in, you put your name, your email address, and your address in, and within about 2 days, you'll get 7 quotes from installers that have been pre-screened by Energy Sage. They'll give you side-by-side quote comparison. They'll have solar advisors will help you make sense of the competing bids, and you won't get any sales calls from those 7 bidders until you press a button that says you want to hear from them. And you're absolutely under no obligation to install. In full disclosure, Energy Sage gets a cut from the project if an installation does happen, and so do we at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. But we've sent hundreds of people through this program, and the customer satisfaction is very high. My own brother went through the program, and even with the revenue that goes to Energy Sage and Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and the Energy Sage platform is proven to cut costs by about 15% compared to what you would get through the market otherwise. As I said, Green Energy Consumers is working with some partners, Palmer Capital, One Way Development, and Resident Energy. We're supported by the Mass Clean Energy Center. And it's a program called Equisol. And what we want to do is put rooftop solar on the homes of low and moderate income people, tenants as well as homeowners in Boston and other cities around the Commonwealth, and I think also Rhode Island at some point. And our goal is to do at least 100 homes this year. We need to sign them up. We need to apply to the federal government for the tax credits, and we're trying to do this. And we'll also have a community shared solar component to that. So watch for some information about that. Next slide. I will turn it now over to Loie Hayes, who is our resident expert on heating and energy efficiency.
All right, thanks, Larry. Yeah, it's exciting times. We have to change all of our heating systems to make them run on things that are not killing the planet. So we're jumping on that as hard as we can. If you're thinking about upgrades to your home energy efficiency, your energy systems, know first that there is the federal energy efficiency tax credit. That's 30% of your energy efficiency costs up to certain limits, $2,000, for instance, for heat pumps or heat pump water heaters, $600 for electrical panels. You can see the other items, windows, doors, etc. It's capped at $1,200 per year, plus the $2,000 if you're installing a heat pump or a heat pump water heater. If you're not doing that, it's going to be just the $1,200 per year. There is no rollover, so if you think, oh, I've spent $12,000 on a heat pump, so I should be able to take 6 years worth of tax credits. No, you can just take it in the first year. But it is great that it is going for 10 years, so you can plan a different thing every year. This includes, the electrical work, which is going to be expensive for a lot of people. We have a link there to the IRS site on these tax credits. And you may have heard about IRA rebates. There are rebates coming, we think, in 2024. And there is a site on the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources page where you can sign up for updates. I've signed up for that, and I find it very helpful. They send out press releases from time to time with new information about the rebates, but we haven't yet seen a site like that for Rhode Island, and we haven't yet received a date about when they'll actually be taking applications for rebates or exactly what they'll be offering rebates for. So stay tuned on the rebates, but yes, take advantage of the tax credits starting this year. There are state incentives, certainly, both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The Mass Save program covers most communities in Massachusetts. If you live in a town with a municipal light plant, you should check their website instead. And of course, in Rhode Island, there's Rhode Island Energy and EnergyWise Rhode Island. And now the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources is offering additional funding for heat pumps. I'll go into that in just a minute. In Massachusetts, there's the whole home heat pump rebate. So this is if you're converting 100% of your heating needs to heat pumps, that rebate is $10,000. If you have a moderate income household, that rebate is increased to $16,000. And if you're a low income household, that subsidy is 100% if you're qualified by your local CAP agency or the ABCD Statewide Client Services Center for a heat pump conversion. Now, for homes that want to retain an active fossil fuel system, that's what we call a partial. It could be for a part of your house, or it could be for the coldest weather that you would keep the fossil fuel backup to turn on at that time. There is an incentive for that, but it's measured by ton of heating capacity. It's $1,250 per ton. The average house might use anywhere from, say, 2 tons to 5 tons, 6 tons, depending on how big the house is, whether you have cathedral ceilings, etc. But for every ton of capacity that you provide by heat pump, you can get this partial home incentive. There are also incentives for geothermal heat pumps. These take the heat out of the ground and take the cooling out of the ground as opposed to out of the air. They're very efficient because the temperature under the ground stays around 50 degrees all year long. And it's much easier to get heat out of 50 degrees than it is to get out of the zero temperature air. The incentive is higher for geothermal heat pumps. It's $15,000 plus, of course, that 30% federal tax credit, which is different from the 2,000 for heat pumps, and that's increased to 30,000 for income eligible households. The incentive is greater because the cost of installation is greater. In Rhode Island, the geothermal incentive is just $1,250 per ton, and of course that's in addition to the federal tax credit. And there are additional incentives for heat pump water heaters and just about every other energy efficient appliance that you can imagine. There are incentives if you choose the most efficient options. Now, about the Rhode Island heat pump incentive, Clean Heat Rhode Island is the campaign that was launched on September 1st. And one of the really great consumer services that it offers is this free consultation with heat pump experts who are not trying to sell you any equipment, but in fact are trying to educate you about your home, about the potential technologies, and potentially reviewing, most likely reviewing quotes that you've received and giving you feedback on those different quotes so that you can make a really informed choice. Rhode Island chose to allocate $25 million in federal funding for this program. The incentive is $1,350 per ton, but that's depending on what fuel is displaced. For some fuels, it's less than that. There is extra money for electric service upgrades, so that's wonderful. And again, if you're in a low-income household, your subsidy can be up to 100%. They're not offering that for homes that are currently heated with gas heat because the cost effectiveness of that conversion is just more tentative, and they don't want to put anybody at risk of having higher energy bills rather than lower if they're in a low-income household. And there's the website for more information. Green Energy Consumers does run a heat pump program. It's to advise consumers, to educate consumers, to help consumers find trusted vendors and sound advice when they're actually doing heat pump shopping. We have an online portal where you can find a list of trusted heat pump installers for free. This is installers in Eastern Massachusetts only. Unfortunately, we couldn't find installers beyond that area, but we're happy to refer you to those people and to make personal introductions so that you can get prompt service from them. Through our website also, you can get a 50% discount on an independent quote comparison, which is a really valuable tool, a 3-page report, extremely readable and substantive. It does cost $75. We think that's more than worth it. You can also book an expert consultation for your home for only $150. Again, really valuable tool to be able to talk with an expert who's not trying to sell you anything. So this is really useful. And you can find more details on our website. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Anna for transportation.
Thanks, Loie. Let's go. So the main thing that most people think of when they think of the IRA and transportation is the Clean Vehicle Credit. This is the federal tax credit for the purchase of an electric vehicle. And if the last time you were thinking about getting an electric car was before the IRA, there's lots of new changes to the federal tax credit. So that's what we'll be going through today. So the first thing you should know is that the federal tax credit amount is up to $7,500. The amount differs per vehicle, and how much you can claim depends on your personal tax liability. So if you purchase a vehicle that qualifies for the full federal tax credit, but your personal tax liability is not $7,500, the IRS won't write you a check for the difference. But we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. Like the other tax credits we've talked about, this one is valid through 2032, which means you can plan out your purchase. But the first new thing to know about is that there are now income requirements. In order to qualify for the federal tax credit, your income needs to be under these limits. So if you file jointly, that's $300,000. If you're the head of household, it's $225,000. And if you're an individual filer, that's $150,000. And this federal tax credit is available for battery electric vehicles, so BEVs, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which are known as PHEVs, and fuel cell electric vehicles as well. But in all of those categories, there are now new vehicle requirements, which we'll go over on the next slide. So the new vehicle requirements basically fall into three categories. The first is that in order to qualify, the vehicle has to be assembled in North America. And there's a tool available that you can click on when we send you these slides to type in any particular vehicle's identification number, and then you can figure out where it is assembled. But any vehicle that is not assembled in the US, Canada, or Mexico does not qualify for the federal tax credit. The second requirement is a price requirement. So in order to qualify for the tax credit, a vehicle has to be under one of these two MSRP price caps. So this is the manufacturer's suggested retail price. For SUVs, vans, and pickup trucks, that limit is $80,000. And for sedans and hatchbacks, it's $55,000. One thing I want to make clear, particularly because of the way that the car market looks right now, is if you purchase a vehicle that the MSRP is $54,000, but with the packages that you choose and taxes and titles and registration and all that, it comes over $55,000. That doesn't matter. It's the MSRP that you need to look at, and we have a list on our website to help you figure that out. The third requirement is the complicated one. So the IRA creates two sets of requirements for the batteries, one about where the battery components are assembled, and one about where the minerals that go into the battery manufacturing process, where those come from. And every year there's a requirement that a certain percentage of those components come from the United States or one of our allied countries, and that percentage goes up every year. So manufacturers have to prove to the IRS and the Treasury that they're meeting these requirements. If they are assembled in North America and meet the price requirement and don't meet either battery requirement, then there is no federal tax credit. If they meet the assembly location requirement and the MSRP price cap and meet only one of the two battery requirements, then it's $37.50. And if they're assembled in North America, are under the relevant price cap and meet both the mineral and the battery component requirements, the full amount is $7,500. I'm going over all of this just so you understand the background, but don't worry, you do not need to memorize this. There are handy tools that will just tell you what any particular model qualifies for, but this is the background from the IRA. There is, however, one way to get around some of these complications. So when you as an individual purchase an electric vehicle, the requirements we went through on the last slide are the ones that are relevant. If you lease, the situation is a little bit different because the Inflation Reduction Act, in addition to creating a residential or a personal vehicle tax credit, creates a commercial vehicle tax credit. So if you are a commercial entity and you purchase a vehicle for your fleet, you can take advantage of a commercial vehicle tax credit that does not have the same complicated requirements as the personal vehicle tax credit. And what that means is that a lot of the basically banks, dealer banks that manufacturers work with when you lease a vehicle, those entities are claiming the commercial vehicle tax credit. And many, but not all, are passing that on to consumers in the form of lower lease payments. So you may see some vehicles being advertised with a $7,500 lease rebate. That is likely the federal tax credit being passed on from the commercial entity to you, the customer. So long story short on this front, if you have your eye on a car that doesn't qualify for the federal tax credit, but you're really determined to get that particular model, take a look at leasing and you may see really competitive pricing there. One thing that we're very excited about in the Inflation Reduction Act is that it creates a tax credit for used vehicles as well as new, because we know that a huge chunk of people never buy a new vehicle, but we also want to make sure that people who buy used vehicles can get into these EVs. The first thing to know about the used EV tax credit is that the battery requirements do not apply. So you don't need to worry about tracking mineral or battery components from a vehicle that's a couple years old. Next, the amount is $4,000 or 30% of the sales price, whichever is lower. There is a requirement that you purchase the vehicle from a dealership, so you can't purchase from a friend or from somebody on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace or what have you. It has to be from a licensed dealer. The vehicle itself must be at least 2 years old and cost less than $25,000. And then it only applies at the first resale. And then the last point is that there are smaller income requirements. It's basically the income requirements for new vehicles cut in half. So for joint filers, it's $150,000 instead of $300,000. And for individuals, it's $75,000 instead of $150,000. If we move to the next slide, this is something that's very exciting and coming soon. The IRA said that in 2024, the federal tax credit should be available at the point of sale, meaning that a consumer, when you walk into a dealership, can choose to transfer the tax credit to the dealership so that you get that cost reduction right off the bat. Because lots of people can't afford to spend $7,500 when they purchase a car and then wait up to a year basically to get that money reimbursed. We're really excited to see this provision. It's going to kick in at some point in 2024. There is an application portal open for car dealerships to sign up to make this available at their dealers. So the details on all of this in terms of what dealers you'll be able to do this at in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that's all still TBD. But the key point of this, besides the fact that you'll be able to capture the value of this tax credit faster, is that it reduces or it eliminates that issue of if your personal tax liability isn't high enough of you not being able to get the federal tax credit, because if you transfer the tax credit to the dealership, your tax liability is basically irrelevant. As long as your income is still under the limits and the vehicle otherwise qualifies, you can get the federal tax credit. So this is really exciting. We're definitely going to keep our eyes on this next year, and we will have a webinar once we know how that's going to actually roll out. But that's a very exciting part of the IRA. We have a whole webinar about incentives for electric vehicles, both for individuals and for commercial entities. So we're not going to cover all of that here, but I just wanted to make a quick reminder that if you are in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, there are incentives that you can stack on top of that federal tax credit. So in Massachusetts, we've got the More EV rebate, which is $3,500 for eligible vehicles. More EV truck, which offers a higher amount for basically electric pickup trucks, and then More EV used for used vehicles, and More EV plus, which is a higher rebate amount for low-income drivers. Rhode Island's got a very similar program with slightly different amounts. Drive EV is sort of the standard version, and it's available for new and used electric vehicles. And then Drive EV Plus is this higher rebate amount for low-income drivers. So in both of those cases, you can stack those incentives on top of each other to really bring down the price of an electric vehicle. We'll send out these slides. We've got a link to our incentives page where you can learn all about that. And I think I'm ready for the next slide. So we have a tool on our website that you can visit if you go to greenenergyconsumers.org/drivegreen. There's a big friendly button that says Find Cars. And when you click on that, you'll come to this tool where we have all the latest information and the key information about the different vehicles that are actually available on the market. So for each one, we'll list some of the fast facts. So we'll tell you what the range is, how many seats there are, what kind of charging capabilities the vehicle has. And then on the right, we'll show you what is the base MSRP, what is the federal tax credit, and what is the state rebate. And then we'll do the math for you and show you, okay, if you start with the base MSRP and subtract those two incentives, you can expect to pay about this much. So you can use this tool to sort and filter by different characteristics. So if you're looking for a vehicle that has at least 200 miles of range and is all electric and has 7 seats, we'll show you what the options are. And this means you've really got a one-stop shopping kind of place to figure out what vehicles you might be in the market for. So you don't have to go out and figure out what percentage of the minerals in the battery come from countries where the US has a free trade agreement. So this link is on our website. We'll share it in the slides as well, but our hope is that it'll make the car shopping process a lot easier by just showing you everything in one place. We've talked mostly about electric vehicles, but of course you need to charge those vehicles somewhere. And the IRA, in addition to the tax credit for vehicles, institutes a tax credit for installing charging stations. This is both for commercial and residential. Today we're talking about residential. The amount is 30% of the cost of installing a charging station at home, not to exceed $1,000. But it's only available in certain census tracts. So in order to qualify, the property has to be in a census tract that is either qualified as low income or non-urban, aka rural. We've made a little how-to guide of how to figure out if your property is in one of those two categories. We're linking to it here, but it's also on our website. But you can use that to figure out if this is an incentive that you can take advantage of. If you live in Massachusetts, there are lots of other incentives from mostly the electric utilities, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil. And we've got all of that information on our website, but there's pretty significant incentives there depending on what kind of building you live in and where it is for both the infrastructure upgrades and the actual hardware of the charging station. So definitely check that out on our website. And if you live in a multi-unit dwelling that has 5 or more units, in Massachusetts, there's a special rebate program from the state called Mass EVIP that can help cover the costs of installing charging there as well. For any Rhode Islanders on the call, right now, there aren't any incentives to install charging, but we're hoping that Rhode Island Energy will propose some soon. Moving right along, I just want to highlight that there's so much more to the IRA than just the tax credit on the transportation front. The production tax credit, which for a long time has helped spur the growth of the wind industry in the US, is now extended to battery manufacturing. And we've already seen a bunch of manufacturers declare that they're going to build new plants in the battery belt and other places in the country. The EV tax credit itself is structured in a way to incentivize manufacturers to build batteries that use components or minerals that were recycled from previous batteries. So you're seeing a lot of news about different companies working to make a closed loop cycle of making sure old EV batteries get reused into new EV batteries or recycled into new EV batteries. If we go to the next couple of bullets, Loie. There's also a lot of direct funding. So there's billions of dollars in terms of loans to new clean vehicle manufacturing plants, or just straight out grants to revamp existing auto plants into ones that produce electric vehicles. And if you go back to the tool that Larry showed at the very beginning, you can filter by clean vehicle, and you can see some of those projects. There's news about this all the time of new plants being announced across the country. And then there's also money for zero emissions equipment at ports, because it's not just vehicles and trucks, but also forklifts and all sorts of things that pollute the air, not just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of the type of pollution that harms human health. So there's a ton in the IRA, all of which is working and changing the market right now. So one thing that I know people are particularly interested in with electric vehicles is this issue of the batteries and manufacturing. And this is a map from the International Council on Clean Transportation that shows within the US different types of battery plants, either ones that recycle lithium ion batteries, or ones that build lithium-ion batteries. And this is a great resource. You can click on the link when we send it, but you can see that there's a lot of growth happening in this space. And when we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what this looks like in the big picture. So this is a graph that shows you the amount of investment in electric vehicles since 2015. And you can see that we took a big jump with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we're not even talking about today, and then an even bigger jump with the Inflation Reduction Act. All of this means there's new models coming. There's new models coming that are going to be manufactured in the United States. And this is the kind of sort of investment where we might not see it right now, but in a year or two, it'll be really clear. And then I think I only have one more slide, and then we can turn to some questions. Coming back to that question of recycling, 2 slides ago, we had a map of all the different recycling plants in the US, and it's a lot and it's more coming, but it might not look like enough. But the International Council on Clean Transportation did a really thorough analysis of this and found, okay, based on how many electric vehicle batteries are actually being retired right now, do we have the capacity to actually recycle those batteries? And what they found is that the installed and announced recycling capacity that we have as of September, when they did this analysis, will carry us through the next couple of years for sure, because a lot of the electric vehicles that are on the market are new enough that their batteries are nowhere near being ready to retire, which means we have some time to build up that market to really make sure that once we start retiring vehicles en masse, that the capacity is there. So definitely doesn't mean we shouldn't keep pushing on this piece, but it does mean some good stuff is happening so we can get prepared for this transition. And I think that's my last slide, unless I've forgotten one. Larry, back to you.
Thank you, Anna and Loie. So now we're going to get into the questions. Before we open it up for questions, I have to do my job. We have a great staff, as you can tell, with Anna, Loie, and many others back at the offices. And so we, as a nonprofit, are dependent upon contributions from foundations, government grants, and individuals. If you're able to make a donation, please go to our website and give now. And what's really nice is from now through December 31st, a generous donor is going to match contributions up to $15,000. So if you were to contribute $100 tonight, they would match that, and so we would earn $200. And if you wanted to do a monthly donation of $10 a month, they would match that as well for at least the first year. And Anna has put the link to that webpage into the chat. So we'll start answering some questions. William asked, to what extent can someone double or triple dip on the tax credits for solar, for heating, for the electrical panel, and the electric vehicles? And you can do it all. What's interesting, okay, the solar you can get, it's 30% or more for the next 10 years, regardless of whether or not you do heat pumps or electrical panel work or electric vehicles. Same with the electric vehicles. If you can get the tax credit for that, it's independent of what you would get from solar or heating. One area where they are the tax credits for a heat pump or for a heat pump water heater, they're up to $2,000 per year. And so those you can double dip with the solar or the electric vehicles, but that's as far as it goes, is the $2,000. If you install, if you have to upgrade your electrical panel to accommodate the heat pump or the heat pump water heater, you get $600 in the electrical panel. So that's a $2,600 tax credit. If you were to do the electrical panel independently without the heat pump or the heat pump water heater, you would not get the $600. So to help clarify that, if you go to Rewiring America, their calculator, they'll actually produce a long list of all the things that you can get. And they'll show you essentially what your bank account is, if you want to think of it that way. That's the kind of money that Uncle Sam is holding in an account in your name, if you want to draw upon that. Another question is, how large a yard is necessary for a ground source heat pump, and how much expensive is it to install? I would say we're not experts on ground source heat pumps yet. Lowy has been doing great work on air source heat pumps, whether they're ducted or ductless. But we are now doing some research on ground source heat pumps. I would say if you've got a good size yard relative to the size of your house, that's about as far as I can tell you. And they are a bit more expensive to install. The incentives at the federal level and the state level are pretty attractive, though. And if you're going to be in the property for a while, a ground source heat pump is a very efficient way to heat. So it might cost a bit upfront, but it's going to end up providing heating and cooling to you at a lower cost over time. So we are doing some research on what contractors are good for ground source heat pumps. Our program for heat pumps right now is for the air source heat pumps. Susan, go ahead.
I'm going to jump in real quick on the previous question about double dipping. For the federal tax credit for electric vehicles, you are only allowed to take one every 3 years.
Oh.
So that is a minor but important detail that is they're not trumpeting about, but it is in fact a rule about the federal tax credit for EVs.
Well, I know a fair amount of the tax credits, but if there's one person who knows more about the EV tax credits, it's Anna. So, but also, I should, one more thing, I thought she was going to catch me on. The EV tax credit is limited to your tax liability. So if you have a tax liability of $5,000 and you get a $7,500, a car that is eligible for $7,500, the most you'll get as a tax credit is $5,000. So that would also apply to the solar tax credit would come into that as well. So you'd have to look at your tax liability a little bit, and to sequence when you would get your solar panels and your electric car and all that. But I guess it would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that if you're going to electrify your home with heat pumps and electric cars, and your home is good for solar, which is it's south facing or southwest facing, it's unshaded, the roof is relatively new, then you're going to end up running at a lower cost, your car and your home. So you might want to go for that. Loey, Susan has a question. What's the range of cost for a residential heat pump system?
It varies greatly depending on the size of the house and the heat load that's needed. But you can think of it as a very small, simple install, maybe even just a partial install might be $6,000. And a McMansion might be $30,000. Generally, we say a small system is going to be between, say, $6,000 and $10,000, and a whole home system starts kind of at the $15,000 range, and on average might get into the high 20s. But as I said, there are ones that are more expensive than that too.
Thank you. This person saying that they're going to knock down an existing single-story home, rebuild on the existing foundation, wants to be as eco-friendly with solar and heat pumps. Is there a resource to consult with that will develop a whole house strategy for energy needs and capturing all the rebates and incentives? I would say that a good architect or engineer ought to be able to help you with that. We'd recommend that you go to what's called passive house construction, which is as making the envelope as efficient as possible, and that will help you heat your home and cool your home with the smallest possible heat pump system. That will save you some money there. And And then, you certainly want to orient it so that it's south facing, so that you can benefit from the solar. We have allies at an organization called Zero Carbon Mass. Is that a good source, Loie, for finding an architect or an engineer? You know?
I don't know, but I would recommend looking at the Mass Save website for what's called major renovations. It's new construction and major renovations. And there's a whole outline of how you can plan to take advantage of all the rebates that are available. So they have a program for you.
Okay, I'm going to put into the chat, folks, Zero Carbon Massachusetts. I think they have a website. I'm almost certain of that. I know that they are led by architects and engineers who are trying to promote all electric new construction. So I would recommend you might want to look at that. There's probably some good resources on that, even if they don't list contractors.
Can I jump in again one more time?
No.
You made me nervous about the 3-year requirement, and I just went and double checked. The you can only apply every 3 years is a requirement for the used vehicle federal tax credit, but not the new vehicle tax credit. It's very confusing. I'll clarify it in the follow-up email, but thank you for saying that because I double checked.
Okay. Then person asked, can we explain the difference between a heat pump and geothermal? And so heat pumps are come in 2 flavors: air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. The ground source heat pump and the term geothermal is pretty much synonymous. And with a ground source heat pump or geothermal, they're taking the heat that's in the ground that's warmer in the winter than the air that we have, and so you're bringing it up. And in the summer, it's the ground is cooler than the ambient air, so there's benefits from pulling the temperature up from the ground that way. The heat pump, air source heat pumps run like a reverse air conditioner, and in the winter, and then they can also cool in the summer. And so again, just real quickly, Loie, can you briefly go over the cost of the heat pump, air source heat pumps?
Sure.
We don't really have good figures on the geothermal, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, a geothermal could be 4 times the cost of a heat pump, depending on what kind of system it is. The incentive is greater for the geothermal, $10,000 for the heat. For an air source heat pump, $15,000 for a ground source or geothermal system. They're both heat pumps. It's just a question of where you're drawing the cost from. I mean the energy from. Yeah, and in terms of cost, yeah, we're looking at, you could think of an air source heat pump whole home system being, say, in the 20s, and a geothermal being in the 40s. But it really depends on what your situation is, what the soil is like, what your property is like, what your house needs are. So that could be a very fungible number.
Yeah. Kenneth asked, are there plans for us to vet, meaning scrutinize and approve battery installers? Well, we do indirectly. If you go to our Energy Sage program, perhaps Anna or Loie could put that URL into the chat. Green Energy Consumers, look for our solar program. The best way to get a home battery installer is through Energy Sage, because more and more when people are getting solar, they're getting batteries. But that's the place to go to if you already have solar and you want battery added, or if you don't want solar and you want just the battery. And just remember, I would go through Energy Sage. They'll help you get competing bids from reputable installers. They've already done that. They've reviewed them to our satisfaction. That's why we partner with them. And then Um, the Susan says, signed up for solar, has to pay despite the tax credit. I appreciate the tax credit very much, but paying for solar means I can't do heat pumps or electric vehicles. Any hope for those of us who don't have a lot of money? Well, I'll turn it over to both Loie and to Anna. I would say with electric vehicles, we're expecting the price to come down over the next few years quite a bit. The technology is improving. Battery costs are coming down very rapidly. The last several months have been good in that respect. Within a couple of years, we expect to see what's called cost parity between electric cars and gasoline-powered cars. But Anna can point to the fact that there are some very affordable EVs now, and then there's the used EV markets improving. Do you want to go over that, Anna?
I'll briefly say that I showed a screenshot of our Drive Green shopping tool, which shows you the new vehicles, but we have an equivalent one for used vehicles where we've grouped previous model years of certain vehicles together based on if they had the same original electric range. So you can go there and sort and filter and say, I want a vehicle that had at least 100 miles of range originally, and then we'll show you what sort of low and high price estimates are based on the website Edmunds. But sort of larger picture, looking at your question, I think one of the key messages of the Inflation Reduction Act is that all of these tax credits are in place until 2032, which means you can pace out investments regardless of what your situation is. You can kind of look at, okay, if I want to get off fossil fuels, these are the things I need to do. And you can say, okay, for me, the next immediate step is this, I'll do this. And then a couple of years later, I can do that. And you can kind of plan it out. Doing it all at once is definitely challenging, I think, for the best of us. And I would say specifically, heat pumps, and I think Loie will agree with me on this, are more challenging than EVs, pretty much in every situation, I'd say. So I think depending on how recently your home's been insulated and things like that, I would look at an EV maybe as the next option, particularly because, as Larry said, the prices are coming down, and then sort of maybe lay the groundwork for heat pumps. But I'll let Loie speak to that too.
Yeah, by getting solar, you certainly have taken the first step toward economizing on your eventual conversion to heat pumps, because solar will, having your own solar will lower the cost of your electricity, which of course is, what you're going to be powering. It's going to determine your operating cost. You definitely want to take advantage of any installation offers that you have from the Mass Save or Rhode Island Energy programs. Do as much insulation as you possibly can. Look at other ways that your home might be leaking heat, and that will make it more affordable to go to heat pumps eventually too. And as Anna said, the credits are there for many years, and heat pump technology will continue to improve. So you may be able to convert for less in 3 years than you can for now. So definitely plan ahead and think about what's the natural life cycle of the various things that I have to maintain, your water heater, your car, etc., and try to think about planning for replacement when those things are naturally going to need replacement.
Yeah, to use my own home as an example, we went with an electric clothes dryer, and so that's an advantage. We've removed the gas appliance for that, and right now we're planning to have a heat pump water heater. So we've upgraded the panel, so now we can have the heat pump water heater without a problem, and so we'll try to take that tax credit and consider the heat pump for space heating in another year. Another thing we're looking at maybe for 2024 or 25 is an electric stove, an induction stove. So that gets to what Loie's talking about. There are different ways you can convert your gas appliances or fossil fuel appliances to electricity over time. Next question for Anna. Peter's been driving a 2018 Nissan Leaf for 5 years, noticing issues with the fast charger availability in Rhode Island. And he thinks that the problems are giving people pause about charging in Rhode Island. And what are your thoughts on that?
We have heard this in so many different variations in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts. There's not enough chargers, and too many of the chargers don't work when people pull up to charge. I will say that I am actually hopeful that we are reaching a turning point for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being that the other major federal climate law that we didn't actually talk about today is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. And one of the many things that that law did was set up the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI program, which is allocating funding to all of the states to make sure that we have a DC fast charging network that is built out so that there's a charging station every 50 miles on major highways. And so Massachusetts and Rhode Island are both about to release a request for proposals to actually put those stations in the ground. And there are several requirements associated with that federal funding that I think will result in a better experience for drivers. So one is that every site has to have at least 4 stations that are capable of charging at 150 kilowatts simultaneously. So sometimes now when you stop somewhere, there's only 1 or 2 stations. At these federally funded stations, there will always be 4. And there are uptime requirements associated with funding. So the stations have to be functional. I think it's 98% of the time under the rules of that funding. So hopefully in the next year or two, we'll see a lot more DC fast charging as a result of that federal funding. There's actually several phases of it, so we'll be seeing the impacts for a while. And that, coupled with the tax credit for installing charging, and then utility programs in Massachusetts, they're in place now. In Rhode Island, they're hopefully coming soon. All of that should mean that there's a lot more charging and a lot better charging in the coming years. But if you've been driving a Leaf since 2018, I'm sure you've seen some of the issues that will hopefully get turned around with this, with these developments.
I think there's one last question. Somebody asked, are heat pump washers and dryers included as incentives as well? And as Loie answered in writing, but I just thought others would want to make sure people heard it. We don't know yet what the federal government's going to have rebates for washers and dryers coming out. It'll probably be limited mostly by people's income. Those programs, as Loie said, we're waiting to hear more about the details of the federal and state programs. They're going to be administered by the Massachusetts Office of Energy Resources and the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. So we just don't have that information yet, but already in existence in both states. You can get rebates from Mass Save if you're in Massachusetts, or from Rhode Island Energy if you live in Rhode Island, for appliances that are rated Energy Star. So we'd recommend you go to those pages and look to see what you can get for incentives for those. And Kenneth from Attleboro is asking what kind of resources are available for municipal related programs. I don't know if Attleboro has achieved what's called green community status, but Massachusetts has a strong program called Green Communities, which is if the community meets a few criteria, it becomes designated a green community. Most cities and towns are green communities. and they are annually will receive a check from the state to support green energy work. I would start by looking to see if Attleboro is one of those communities. And I should know, but I can't remember if Attleboro has municipal aggregation. I think it does, but that's what we have seen. We recently wrote a guidebook on that, or a status report on municipal aggregation. So we would hope that Attleboro has municipal aggregation. And then what I would say is all these incentives that we've just talked about are very ripe for planning at the municipal level to find the sites. There are incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act and also the bipartisan infrastructure law for things ranging from solar farms, putting solar on rooftops, geothermal, battery storage, microgrids, electric buses, all kinds of electric vehicles of all sizes. And Anna is actually working on an electric school bus project. We're trying to reduce the barriers to adoption. But there's also the states also have incentives for electric trucks of various kinds. So there's a lot there. And if you have any further questions, you can email us at on the screen right now is how you can reach me or Loie or Anna. And I think we're done with questions, and I hope everyone enjoyed this. We will send you the slides and some links after this, probably in another day or two. And we'll see you at another time. We do have other events coming up. If you go to our Green Energy Consumers, look for our events page. Anna and her team do a lot of webinars about electric vehicles. Loie does a lot of webinars about heat pumps, essentially EV 101 and heat pump 101, where we tell you all about those things. And we have webinars about solar with Energy Sage, and we have a lot of webinars about public policy.